Welcome back. This time I am with William Dempsey. He is the founder of Heads Held High and Heads Held High Counseling, and has years of experience with transsexual people. Um, he probably will help us understand what transsexual people really go through. But because I am sure from our pre-interview that we share most of the goals, but probably not the ways the current trans activism is trying to achieve them. If that's really their goal. Um, you see, the transsexual activism is, if you pay attention to their own declarations, not mischaracterization, but in their own words, their priorities are the pronouns, the priorities are the minority of trans athletes or actors and actresses who work in movies. So if you present this to a West Virginia man who, for instance, may say, and if you follow stories about West Virginia, this could not be unusual. That hears that can say that her sister is hooked on OxyContin, his brother has committed suicide, his father is an alcoholic because he feels he has failed in life. When he hears all this nonsense, he will not conclude these activists are mediocre. He will conclude these people, transsexual people, don't have real problems. I have real problems, so I will vote for Trump. And the problem is that then you will feel the backlash, and the backlash is not going to be on the pronouns or their DEI positions they love so much. The backlash is going to be on what we see from cutting grants on mental health in the NIH, the exclusion of transsexual people from the military. That means their career, their life in many cases, and we will see how this impact transsexual people, not the activists, but transsexual people. Because at least after the Civil Rights Acts, you have the Civil Rights, after the Civil Rights Movement, you have the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. And after this extravaganza of trans activists, you have nothing. Just they getting jobs in DEI positions as executive or counselors or whatever. So, and yet you see that despite beyond the shallowness of these activists, what you have in transsexual people is high levels of depression, high levels of bullying. They are victims of bullying. The high levels of depression, of poverty because and job insecurity, and even I have heard about their options limited to, in many cases, to sex work. So please will help us understand how deep could this depression be, so we can, beyond the frivolous extravaganza and mischaracterization by these bad trans activists, how really feels to be a transsexual person, so we can understand the levels of depression they go through.
Yeah, I mean, I want to acknowledge that I'm, of course, speaking from being a cis person, but from working with clients as long as I have, the depression runs very deep. I mean, a lot of times it's associated with trauma, trauma that is not limited to the trans experience, but is certainly exacerbated by some things that are, such as being isolated from family and friends due to their gender identity or being shoved out of their home, sometimes before even 18, being put through foster care systems, etc. And so these things are going to cause and perpetuate trauma symptoms, which is often closely tied to depression. On top of the things that you already named, there's a lot of systemic barriers, such as, difficulty with housing, difficulty with employment, a lot of other things that, yes, other people experience, but the trans community experiences at higher levels, which also is going to increase rates of depression. Um, and so there is one could say, a greater depth of the depression that they experience, or at the very least, the frequency of it, because of the consistent external factors that perpetuate the depressive symptoms.
But I would like to probably of course I'm not going to ask you to mention any names, but in the words of some of the people you counsel, how does it feel, these levels of depression, that levels of fracture inside that have pushed many transsexual people to suicide?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with people that have difficulty maintaining employment because they can't get out of bed in the morning. I've had clients that, have had almost daily thoughts of wanting to end their life. And while they have not taken action, that the thought is still there. And that in and of itself is very frightening for anyone. Um, I've had people that on more I guess extreme cases are agoraphobic. I mean, due to the increase fear that queer people, but especially trans people, have around safety, some people are afraid to leave their homes because they're just afraid of being assaulted, and the rates of that, as we know, have increased year over year the last couple years. And so yeah, I think that
So it's similar to what people who have been violently mugged feel in the next days after the attack.
I you could say that, yes.
So what you think? What I want is to people who are heterosexual like me can understand how transsexual people feel, so they are not misguided or don't use as excuse the ridiculous extravaganza displayed by transsexual activists. So they can understand that there is really pain beyond that. Having said that, probably we are going to start with to have disagreements. But I believe it's healthy because that helps precisely people to understand better the issue. So, for instance, if I were a trans activist, I would be worried about the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, if whether they have people, at least one that is specialized in transsexual issues, because they are overrepresented in firings and poverty for a reason. So, and if I can understand what goes inside the mind of both the abuser and the transsexual people who is victim of this discrimination, I will hardly be better. I hardly will be in a good position to decide whether the complaint is justified or not. Then NIH grants, because I don't mean this weird job books that have produced the postmodernism, where their goal is to create new buzzwords in every book, but I mean peer-reviewed research, and I have tried to find, and I have found in the NIH some papers, but yet there are very few for a minority who is so affected by these mental issues. I believe that there is a need for more research in this field so we can understand better. We cannot help heal a person heal if we cannot understand what that person is going through. So, and I believe we might be in agreement here, yet that is completely absent in the case of transsexual activism. You see these words, things like death threats to J.K. Rowling because she opposes transsexual athletes in women's sports. And of course, and I agree with her because uh, I see a transsexual for the little contact I have had with transsexual people is that they are, for instance, in the case of a trans woman, we are talking about a woman trapped in the body of a man, but still the body is the body of a man, and I believe transsexual people have bigger fish to fry and could not focus on something that is indefensible. Because many times this small, tiny minority of transsexual athletes have sent women to the hospital, and the matter is that, as I mentioned before, the backlash is against all the transsexual community, or the weird people who even celebrated this weirdo who killed two children in a church. So that's but the main concept of empathy, the main the concept that empathy implies is that I have to see you as the same as me.
Mhm.
But on the contrary, you see transsexual activism trying to portray transsexual people as different, probably because of they want to get the queer part on board, but that's counterproductive. Or even, for instance, that there are I cannot deny that there are transsexual minors. But the problem is that if when you apply treatment, I don't need counseling, but chemical treatment, while they are minors, then if the minors were grown and they are it's very usual that they don't know who they are until they grow up more, then you have the regret. And when you have the regret, then you find, and I have seen a couple of times in commissions bringing the people who were induced to gender affirming care, etc., when they were minors, and then they regret their decision. And the problem is that then backfires because helping the people when they are old enough, when they are not minors any longer, to to make the transition is not going to bankrupt the government. It's less than 1% of the population. But those people are affected because of this kind of weird activism. And I know I have piled many things on one question, but please try to give me your take on this.
Yeah, I would say, I think that it's important to note that, as you said, yes, it's less than 1% of the population. I think that it is curious if society were to be more accepting, how much that rate would grow. Similar to, the rates of queer people in general from a sexuality lens has grown a lot as society has gotten more accepting and legislation has followed. So it's curious how many people are just still closeted for safety reasons, but that's a side conversation. Um, and yeah, I do think that there's often conversation around adolescence and HRT and other medical treatment. It is worth mentioning that less than 1/10 of a percent, so not even 1%, but 0.1, are actually on HRT of adolescents, and no one under 12 is allowed to have HRT. So I also just want to be careful that there's often a talking point around that I think is overgrown as a political talking point of adolescents having HRT. And yes, there is a population that's on it, and yes, it's worth talking about. But I think it is important to focus our efforts on the adults. And I think that politically, at least, kids are being used as a scapegoat to demonize trans affirming care as a whole. because there's really not that many that are actually going through it as adolescents.
And these minors, I fully support counseling for these minors. So when they are 18 or more, they can make the right decision. Yet, as you say, it's overgrown because what reaches the headlines are the cases of affirming care, or so it's they have so my another issue with trans activism is that they have over sexualized this issue so much that it's not longer about an identity, or the identity is based only on sex, and we really don't know about that. They are assuming that, so it's there are other dimensions that may be marked by that identity, but it's the same. It's we are forgetting that the basic concept behind empathy is considering that the other person is like. What happens with gay people is just there was a beautiful act by Glad from years ago. I don't know how Glad is doing now, in which they presented a gay couple, but they don't presented them as kissing or groping or no, they presented them as achieving their goals in life, about how their job, getting a career, getting a house, getting a, and then they said, and also the chance to spend their life with the person you love, and only then you realize they are gay.
Hmm.
And that's the right approach, because they make you feel empathy. This person is like me, and the only difference between us is that in their bedroom or wherever, they just love a person of their own sex.
Hmm.
That's completely absent in the case of transsexual activism, right?
Um, Yeah, I think, as with anything, it depends on the lens we're talking about. I'm not too familiar with GLAD specifically, but I do think what you talked about earlier is important to address is the over-sexualization of the community. And this is something we saw, of course, in the 60s and the 70s with gay men. Over time, I think that's kind of devolved, although there is obviously still a fair amount of that in Christian extremism and talking about, man shall not sleep with a man and all this other rhetoric. But now the focus, not only legislatively, but also the hypersexualization piece tied into the legislation has pivoted, and now the target, so to speak, is on the trans community. And so my uh, slightly reluctant but hopeful view is that over time that we'll see a similar shift away from the hypersexualization of it all. Um, but yes, I do think that, as you said, media being produced in a way that shows and normalizes, in this conversation, trans people in the way that it has for gay men in the past, is a stepping stone of moving away from that hypersexualization. So it's important for media to start to do that if it hasn't already. I do think that there is some media out there that does show trans people in a positive light, but of course, there's always a lot of room for growth, and I don't think that we are anywhere near where we need to be in order to see the sort of greater change follow as a result of the media leading the way.
Yeah, for instance, when it comes to gay people, I believe that many more people could identify with gay people when they saw Philadelphia,
Mhm.
or when they saw Dan Choi and Nancy Tsao, who were kicked out of the military because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And that had a much more positive effect than the gay pride parades that looks like extravaganzas that whose message is we are different from you and you have to accept that whether you like it or not. That's the wrong message. The right message is we are like you. Just our sexual options are preferences are different, but we all have feelings in our heart, just like you, and that's completely absent, and that's what upsets me because unless that kind of activism starts right now, because people are not going to connect with transsexual people just like that, as they didn't connect with gay people just like that. It was a word that, in this case, in the case of transsexual people, is absent. Because on the contrary, you see these kinds of sometimes, like I mentioned, is what reaches the headlines, and there is nothing to counter them, are the death threats to J.K. Rowling, something like that, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of understandable, animosity with people like J.K. Rowling. I mean, it's not beyond me that we just had a more extreme version of that yesterday with Charlie Kirk. There's a lot of divisiveness when people are pushing rhetoric that is transphobic. That directly impacts things like legislation. And so there's a lot of hurt. And while I personally will never condone death threats or gun violence,
Mhm.
it's understandable that people are reaching a breaking point. And they're tired of trying to go through um, means that we are supposed to, such as like, talking to your political, talking to those who are supposed to represent you in office, because people are not feeling that that's actually happening. Um, so they're taking matters into their own hands.
Yes, but and of course, neither you nor I condone violence. But the matter is that we don't have. For just to give you an example, in the 60s, you had two alternatives if you were a black person: Martin Luther King's civil rights movement and Stokely Carmichael's Black Power. So you could have a choice, and unfortunately, black people in '68 chose for Carmichael. But at least from the civil rights movement, we have a legacy that is, as I mentioned before, in civil rights legislation. While from the Black Power movement, we only have these vulgar displays of power. Uh, I don't see that in the transsexual activism. And the problem with that is that many gay people even are starting to distance themselves from transsexual people, and that should not be, but that's what is happening because in the transsexual community there has to be a Martin Luther King alternative to the alternative of the Stokely Carmichael, that is what it has invaded the transsexual activism in right now. That's correct. We need an alternative in activism.
Yeah, I think that what's unfortunate, and I've spoken a lot on this in even my personal circles, is that the gay movement and the gay rights movement was primarily led by Black and brown trans women, and they got the rights that we have. And then, in my opinion, the gay community turned around and said, "We have our rights, you worry about it yourself," which is really unfortunate to say the least. And there's even, I don't remember the exact quote, but there's a famous video that I've seen countless times of Sylvia Rivera yelling, saying, like, "I'm fighting for your rights. Why aren't you fighting for mine?" In so many words. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And it's, it speaks volumes that that was in 1969 and we're still experiencing that in 2025. To your point, I do think that there is a discrepancy, where the younger generation, especially Gen Z, there is a lot of advocacy among cisgender people for trans rights, regardless of whether they're queer or not. However, I think that there is something to be said about the age of the Gen Z. Um, I'm forgetting the word, but how old Gen Z are. And so there hasn't been someone, to your point, to like step in and take that leadership role in the way that we've seen in the past. My hope is that as time continues on, that we'll see that. But I think what is also worth noting, of course, is where we're at legislatively. We don't have much time. I mean, I don't want to be doom and gloom, but there are a lot of legislative actions that are taking place, especially in conservative states like Texas or Tennessee, that it is really important that we try to identify someone who's willing to take that leadership role. Because as you said, I mean, we even saw in the 60s and 70s, there's a lot of like ACT UP, right? There was a lot of grassroots organizations that worked even for queer rights in the same way that you talked about it with the civil rights movement. That I agree, I haven't really seen a comparable for um, transgender rights.
Yeah, I agree that unfortunately when you have governments, for instance, like Trump's, they need a scapegoat for their failures, economic and others. Their favorite scapegoat are immigrants, but the second one is transsexual people. And the problem is that and we don't see an Nancy Sao and Dan Choi from the trans community trying to create the empathy that is necessary to contest the frivolous, shallow trans activism we see right now, and that's what we need. And I blame a lot postmodernism and their intersectionality or whatever the word is, because they don't have seek to give visibility to these the problems of these issues, but redefine it. So they decided that the trans community, what they needed is pronouns, the word Latinx, and more trans actors in Marvel movies. They decided that what immigrants needed is open borders. They decided that what the Hispanic and Black community needed are not their priorities as they are presented by Pew Research Service, but blackface, cultural appropriations, or whatever buzzword they come every week. So, so that's my main issue. We need, as Dan Choi, we need a Nancy Sao in the transsexual community to counter this damaging influence, because at the end of the day, who are going to pay the bill are transsexual people, immigrants, and other minorities. So that's my opinion. But I wanted to, just to finish this interview, I have about 5 minutes. I wanted to give you the last word so you can give me your take on what I have just said, plus give visibility on any other issue on which you feel more visibility is needed.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And I think you just touched on a point that I would usually end on anyway, which is that anyone who's listening, just remember that the presidential vote is not the most important one. You need to vote every single election because all of your legislators matter. I think what you're speaking to is that there's a disconnect between those who are in political office and making these legislative decisions and, societal level things, whether we're talking about media, but I focus a lot on legislature. And there's a disconnect between them and the communities they serve. And I mean, we can get on a broader scale with this, even with the Republican Party and the people who voted them in are not feeling that they're taken care of with farmers and all sorts of stuff. But the same goes for the queer community, and especially for the trans community. My hope is that as we're seeing more trans identified individuals being elected into political office, that they are going to be having more conversations with their communities that they're serving and really understand, as you're saying, that yes, pronouns are important, but are not the top three priority list. When people are afraid to leave their homes for safety or feeling depressed because they can't, they're legally able to be discriminated against in employment, housing, etc. So my ask, aside from voting every year and being educated on who is able to be elected in your local, state, etc., um, levels of office, is that all of us, I think, even if we're not in that community, should be reaching out to these trans-identified legislators and saying, like, yes, you don't speak for the whole community, but here's what your community is asking for. As someone, I'm cis, but in the example, if someone who's reaching out or listening to this is trans identified, say, like, as one trans person to another, this is what I think we need. What are you doing? Or, ask them hard hitting questions. What are you doing to be in touch with what your own trans community is needing? And what actions are you taking on that? I think people often forget that just because someone was elected to office doesn't mean that they're guaranteed a spot to stay there. And they know that. And so putting some pressure on, we're not going to reelect you unless you're holding up what you promised or doing what we need you to do holds a lot of weight. So it's important to be in communication with your elected officials.
But I believe there is a premise before that because it's activism. Activists are the salesmen of your plea. If you otherwise, if we are talking about a minority that is less than 1%, because the at least in the gay community their percentage is much higher. So many times you find these governors or congressmen that have had a change of heart, like Cheney, after they had a gay person in their family. But that's much more difficult to happen about in the case of transsexual people. So the importance of these of new activists that reflect the real pleas of this community is much more important. So I'm going to give you the last minute because I don't have much time. But what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that you're right. And I think that, again, my point still stands even for those who are not trans identified. If you want to talk about, people who are democratically elected and like to sit on their high horse about supporting marginalized communities like Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, some of the more like big names. One of my favorites is Jasmine Crockett, right? So, I mean, it's equally important if these people are going to identify as uh, if these people are going to identify as allies to hold them accountable as well. And to your point, it could be also worth saying, like, you're not part of our community, so let's educate you on what our community needs. But the general point, regardless of how you get there, is that we need to be in communication with our legislators in order to make substantive change. Because if we're not communicating to them, they're making change based on what they think is right. And as you and I are talking about today, they're often misguided.
So let's hope we soon find the Dan Choi and the Nancy Tsao of the transsexual community, as gay people did in their fight against Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And having said that, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Okay, thank you.